Chapter 22, Generics in the Real World, Solution Movie 22.1. So in this exercise, you're going to use what you've learned about generics to improve the Business Object Generic class. So for starters, we'll open the generics demo project in Xcode. And I've got that open over here. And we're instructed to select the MMBusinessObjectGeneric.Swift code file in the project navigator. The next step says delete the existing entity class name property. Now, the reason we're doing this is because you may have noticed as you were going through the steps somewhat of an inconsistency. When we created the person and company generic classes, we specified an associated entity class, company entity, and person entity in this case. But notice in the constructor of each of these, we're still passing a string in and storing it into an entity class name property. Now, when it comes to strings, it's really easy to have a typo. So I prefer not to set properties that way unless I need to. And since we're already specifying that the associated entity is person entity right here in the generic declaration, I think we can do better. So let's go back to MMBusinessObjectGeneric, and we are going to delete the existing entity class name property, which is of type string. And we're going to replace it with a computed property named entity class name. So I'll put that up here. We'll move that over a little bit so we can say it. So we'll say this one gets the entity class name string from T. And so our property is called entity class name. As with all computed properties, we specify the type explicitly. And say open and close. So this line of code, we create a variable called class name, and we say NSString from class. So this is part of the Cocoa Touch framework, and we can pass in a class, and here we're going to just use the generic class placeholder T to drive that class name. So it's going to find out what the class name is and return it to us. Now, when it comes to class names in the entity framework, you'll find that the class names have a prefix. Even though if you look at the class names here, you'll just see company entity. When you look at the actual data model, you'll find that company entity is actually genericsdemo.companyentity, and person entity is genericsdemo.personentity. So this is something new in Xcode 6 and iOS 8. So when it comes to deriving the name of the class, we actually have to strip off the genericsdemo prefix. So that's what this next code is about. So here we have our class name, and just in case it changes, we may not always have this. It wasn't in previous versions. Maybe it'll be removed in future versions. So I can add some code here that will kind of bulletproof us. We'll check to see if there is a period in the class name. We can say if class name, we say range of string. We're looking for the string period, and these others are optional parameters. You can get rid of those. Say if range of string is not equal to nil, that means the range of that string was found, then we can say class name equals class name dot path extension. So path extension is used to take an extension off of a file name. So maybe if I've got a file named myfile.txt, it would only return the .txt. So in this case, our path extension is really just returning the full name of the entity and pulling off the prefix. So we're going to say class name dot path extension, and we return class name. All right, so this is our new computed property, which replaces our other property. So if I'm going to build the project, I will see I have some compiler errors. And that's why the next step says fix the compiler errors in the person and company class files. It says we cannot assign entity class name in self. Why is that? Well, if you look back at entity class name, you can see that it is a read-only property. In fact, we're using that syntax. There's no get or set, and when there's only a get, we can actually condense the syntax a bit and just put it between curly braces like this. So this is a read-only property, so we can't even begin to think about storing a value to it. So over here, with our person.swift, we can remove this line of code. And now that we've removed that line of code, we have to ask ourselves, well, why do I need this override of the init? And the answer is, you don't. There's no custom code at this class level. So we go over to company.swift, and it's the same story. We can get rid of this, but once we do, there's no custom code here, so we don't need an override. So now we can build, and our build succeeded. And we can even go back to our view controller class, set a breakpoint, we can run, and we can see instantiating. We've got our person entity, we're able to store values in it, we have a company, a list of companies, we've got a new company entity, we can create it and store that information out. So everything's working great. So now it's much easier to declare new classes because all we have to do is specify the name of the associated entity here, and that's it. I definitely recommend you do the next exercise, exercise 22.2 in this chapter, because you're going to learn how to add a new entity to the entity model, how to create a new entity class from it, and how to use generics to specify the associated class.